Good morning, and welcome to this specialized presentation on psychopathy within legal systems. Over the next several sessions, we'll examine the distinctive patterns that psychopathic individuals display throughout the legal process. Patterns that challenge conventional understanding and require specialized professional responses. Psychopathy represents not merely an extreme version of antisocial behavior, but a fundamentally different way of processing social relationships, obligations, and consequences. This neurological difference manifests consistently across legal contexts, creating recognizable signatures that informed professionals can identify and address. Our presentation will systematically explore how psychopathy manifests at each stage of legal engagement. We'll begin by examining contractual relationships, where psychopaths demonstrate distinctive patterns of entering agreements with predatory intent rather than mutual benefit, viewing terms as tactical obstacles rather than binding commitments. We'll then analyze their civil litigation strategies, revealing how psychopaths transform straightforward disputes into wars of attrition, leveraging procedural mechanisms not for legitimate resolution, but for strategic exhaustion of opponents. Their approach to discovery, motion practice, and settlement negotiations follows consistent patterns that experienced legal professionals can recognize. Our examination of courtroom behavior will demonstrate their remarkable adaptability and presentation, crafting personas precisely calibrated to influence proceedings while displaying the emotional incongruence that serves as a key diagnostic marker. You'll learn to identify the microexpressions and tactical shifts that reveal calculation rather than authentic engagement. We'll explore their distinctive response to legal consequences, where conventional penalties fail to produce typical deterrence or reform. Instead, psychopaths process sanctions through an entirely different framework, focusing on detection avoidance rather than behavior change. Particularly important is our analysis of victim impact, where psychopathic exploitation creates a unique form of traumatic harm extending beyond conventional damages. This signature trauma requires specialized recovery approaches addressing the fundamental reality distortion victims experience. Finally, we'll conclude with evidence-based intervention strategies that move beyond ineffective conventional approaches to establish realistic management frameworks based on external structure rather than internal reform. 11:14 a.m. Share. Psychopaths approach legal boundaries not as moral guidelines, but as arbitrary obstacles to navigate or exploit. Their engagement with courts isn't about justice, but about dominance, revenge, and resource extraction. This fundamental difference in orientation creates a predictable constellation of legal problems that follow psychopaths throughout their lives. What makes this subject critically important is how poorly equipped our legal systems are to address individuals operating without empathy, remorse, or concern for consequences. Institutions designed for rational actors with shared moral frameworks become particularly vulnerable to psychopathic manipulation. Consider how our courts rely on concepts like honesty under oath, good faith negotiations, and the deterrent effect of punishment. For psychopaths, these foundational assumptions become exploitable weaknesses rather than guiding principles. Throughout this presentation, we'll examine how core psychopathic traits, pathological lying, grandiosity, manipulation, and impulsivity, manifest specifically in legal contexts, creating predictable patterns across criminal, civil, and family court systems. We'll see how psychopaths create parallel legal proceedings in multiple jurisdictions, weaponize protective systems against those they're designed to protect, and demonstrate remarkable resistance to rehabilitation efforts. Most importantly, we'll explore how psychopaths exhaust not only the financial and emotional resources of their victims, but often the patience and effectiveness of legal institutions themselves. Their ability to present well initially, while gradually revealing their true nature through inconsistencies and patterns, creates a particularly challenging dynamic for courts to address. By understanding these patterns, we can better identify psychopathic legal strategies, protect potential victims, and develop more effective systemic responses to individuals who view our legal institutions not as pathways to justice, but as weapons to be wielded against those who stand in their way. Psychopaths are disproportionately represented in financial criminal activity, where their distinctive personality traits create a perfect storm of risk factors. Their lack of empathy, manipulative charm, and absence of fear or anxiety make them particularly adept at complex financial deceptions that can operate undetected for years. What distinguishes psychopathic financial criminals is the elaborate architecture of their schemes. Unlike opportunistic fraudsters, psychopaths construct intricate, layered deceptions with remarkable attention to detail. They establish legitimate appearing business entities, create elaborate paper trails, and develop comprehensive false narratives that withstand initial scrutiny. Their financial crimes typically exploit relationship dynamics rather than anonymous targets. They excel at identifying financially vulnerable victims with exploitable trust, systematically cultivating relationships specifically to access resources. What appears as friendship or even romance to victims is merely tactical groundwork for exploitation. Particularly revealing is how psychopaths leverage institutional credibility. They infiltrate respected organizations, accumulate impressive credentials, and associate themselves with legitimate enterprises, all to create a facade of trustworthiness that facilitates their schemes. They understand that most people practice borrowed trust, accepting individuals vouched for by respected institutions. Their approach to risk differs fundamentally from other offenders. Where most criminals balance risk against reward, psychopaths exhibit a disturbing indifference to consequences, continuing fraudulent activities even when detection becomes increasingly likely. This creates a distinctive pattern of escalation rather than the risk mitigating behavior typical of non psychopathic offenders. Perhaps most revealing is how psychopaths respond when their financial schemes begin to unravel. Rather than fleeing or attempting to hide evidence, they often double down, creating additional deceptions, targeting new victims, or developing elaborate countermeasures. Many actually accelerate their criminal activity when under investigation, viewing the challenge as stimulating rather than deterring. This pattern explains why psychopaths frequently leave behind financial devastation of shocking magnitude. By the time their schemes collapse, they've typically extracted maximum resources from primary victims, secondary investors, financial institutions, and often bankruptcy or insurance systems, leaving a complex web of financial harm that extends far beyond direct victims. Understanding these distinctive patterns is essential for financial investigators, as early identification of these behavioral signatures may prevent the catastrophic damage that occurs when psychopathic financial crimes reach their inevitable conclusion. Within family and intimate relationships, psychopaths generate a distinctive constellation of legal problems that reveal the predatory nature of their interpersonal functioning. Unlike typical domestic disputes that arise from emotional reactivity or poor conflict resolution, psychopathic domestic legal issues demonstrate calculated patterns of control, exploitation, and revenge. The cycle often begins with domestic violence that shows sophisticated evidence concealment. Psychopaths don't merely lash out impulsively, they strategically inflict harm in ways difficult to document, targeting areas hidden by clothing, using methods that don't leave marks, or creating alternative explanations for injuries. This calculated approach makes legal intervention exceptionally challenging. When relationships terminate, psychopaths frequently engage in stalking and harassment campaigns precisely calibrated to maximize victim distress while minimizing legal consequences. They demonstrate an uncanny awareness of exactly how close they can come to restraining order violations without triggering enforcement, often maintaining psychological pressure through technically legal but emotionally devastating tactics. Most revealing is their weaponization of the family court system itself. Child custody proceedings become venues not for determining children's best interests, but for punishing partners who attempted escape. Psychopaths frequently make false allegations against former partners as control mechanisms, exploiting mandated investigation processes to create ongoing disruption and financial drain. Financial exploitation within family systems shows particular sophistication. They systematically drain shared resources, conceal assets, create fraudulent debts, and manipulate financial records, often beginning these preparations months or years before the relationship's visible deterioration, revealing remarkable premeditation. Perhaps most disturbing is how psychopaths triangulate legal authorities against victims. They present as reasonable, cooperative parties while portraying victims as unstable or unreliable, effectively co-opting law enforcement, court personnel, and even victim advocates into unwitting agents of continued abuse through manipulation of institutional biases. The civil litigation arena provides perhaps the clearest window into psychopathic functioning, revealing how they approach contracts not as mutual obligations, but as tactical opportunities for exploitation. Their pattern in civil matters demonstrates remarkable consistency across different contexts and jurisdictions. Psychopaths approach contractual relationships with premeditated intent to extract maximum value while providing minimum compliance. They enter agreements with no intention of fulfilling obligations, viewing contract terms as merely technical hurdles to navigate rather than binding commitments. What appears as business failure to courts is often carefully orchestrated extraction of resources. Most revealing is their distinctive litigation strategy when confronted with breach claims. Rather than settling reasonable disputes, psychopaths typically counter with aggressive, retaliatory claims designed not to vindicate legitimate rights, but to exhaust opponents financially and emotionally. They transform straightforward contract disputes into protracted legal wars of attrition. Their civil litigation behavior shows remarkable procedural sophistication. They expertly exploit discovery processes to create delay and expense, file strategic motions precisely timed to create maximum inconvenience, and systematically increase litigation costs to force settlements favorable to themselves despite clear liability. Perhaps most distinctive is their approach to legal representation. Psychopaths frequently change attorneys, often blaming previous counsel for their own intentional non-compliance. This creates discontinuity in representation that fragments institutional knowledge of their pattern and resets professional skepticism with each new advocate. Courtroom behavior and presentation. The courtroom performance of psychopaths reveals perhaps their most distinctive behavioral signature. Unlike typical defendants who display consistent anxiety or hostility, psychopaths demonstrate remarkable adaptability, precisely calibrating their presentation to match whatever persona will most effectively influence proceedings. Most striking is their emotional incongruence, displaying seemingly appropriate emotions that don't match their physiological state. They can present tears without elevated heart rate, show remorse without actual distress, and manufacture indignation without genuine emotional investment. This creates testimony that appears convincing in the moment, but feels hollow upon reflection. Their testimony demonstrates strategic inconsistency. When questioned about incriminating details, psychopaths don't merely lie. They provide elaborate, shifting narratives that incorporate just enough truth to seem plausible, while creating documentation challenges for opposing counsel. Each version contains deliberate ambiguities that provide escape routes when contradictions emerge. Perhaps most revealing is their distinctive reaction to evidence presentation. Unlike typical defendants who show concern or relief based on the content of evidence, psychopaths focus almost exclusively on how evidence impacts their tactical position rather than its truthfulness. Their micro-expressions reveal calculation rather than emotional processing during critical testimony. Psychopaths display a distinctive pattern of courtroom behavior that sets them apart from typical defendants or litigants. Rather than appearing anxious or remorseful, they often present as charming, composed, and even charismatic, using superficial charm to influence judges, juries, and attorneys. Their testimony is typically polished, with confident eye contact and persuasive storytelling, even when lying outright. They skillfully manipulate courtroom dynamics, portraying themselves as victims or reasonable parties, while subtly undermining opponents. Psychopaths frequently shift blame, minimize their actions, and exploit any ambiguity in evidence or procedure. Their lack of genuine emotional response can be mistaken for calm rationality, which sometimes leads legal professionals to underestimate the risk they pose. Recognizing these behavioral patterns is crucial, as psychopaths use the courtroom not as a venue for truth, but as a stage for manipulation and self advantage. Psychopaths display a distinctive pattern of courtroom behavior that sets them apart from typical defendants or litigants. Rather than appearing anxious or remorseful, they often present as charming, composed, and even charismatic, using superficial charm to influence judges, juries, and attorneys. Their testimony is typically polished, with confident eye contact and persuasive storytelling, even when lying outright. They skillfully manipulate courtroom dynamics, portraying themselves as victims or reasonable parties, while subtly undermining opponents. Psychopaths frequently shift blame, minimize their actions, and exploit any ambiguity in evidence or procedure. Their lack of genuine emotional response can be mistaken for calm rationality, which sometimes leads legal professionals to underestimate the risk they pose. Recognizing these behavioral patterns is crucial, as psychopaths use the courtroom not as a venue for truth, but as a stage for manipulation and self advantage. Victims of psychopaths experience a uniquely devastating form of psychological harm that extends far beyond the material or physical damage inflicted. Unlike conventional trauma that disrupts existing belief systems, psychopathic victimization fundamentally rewires how survivors process trust and meaning. Most distinctive is the profound reality distortion victims experience. What they believed was authentic connection was actually calculated exploitation, creating a cognitive rupture where past experiences must be completely reinterpreted. This retroactive dismantling of perceived reality creates a distinct form of betrayal trauma that permeates all relationships. The aftermath typically features severe trust disorientation rather than simple trust issues. Victims don't merely become cautious, they lose confidence in their basic reality testing abilities. Their most reliable judgment mechanisms identified the psychopath as trustworthy, creating a foundational doubt in their own perceptions that complicates recovery. Particularly devastating is the isolation victims experience when describing their experiences to others. The sophisticated manipulation tactics employed by psychopaths often sound implausible to those who haven't encountered such calculated exploitation, leading to institutional skepticism that compounds the original trauma. Perhaps most destructive is how psychopathic victimization transforms strengths into vulnerabilities. The victim's most admirable qualities, empathy, compassion, commitment to relationships, become precisely the mechanisms through which exploitation occurs, creating a profound crisis of identity where victims question whether their best attributes are actually liabilities. This distinctive traumatic signature requires specialized recovery approaches that address not just conventional trauma symptoms, but the unique reality reconstruction necessary after psychopathic exploitation. Effective intervention with psychopaths requires fundamentally different approaches than those used with other populations, as traditional strategies often inadvertently strengthen rather than reduce problematic behaviors. Most critical is recognizing that insight-oriented therapies typically fail with psychopaths. Encouraging emotional exploration and vulnerability actually provides them with enhanced manipulation vocabularies rather than promoting genuine change. Effective interventions instead focus on concrete behavioral contracts with clear, immediate consequences for noncompliance. External structure proves far more effective than attempts to build internal controls. Successful programs establish comprehensive monitoring systems with regular verification rather than relying on self-reporting or promises of reform. This external scaffold must be maintained long term, as temporary oversight merely creates delayed rather than eliminated problematic behavior. Particularly promising are interventions focused on enlightened self interest rather than moral development. Programs that demonstrate how pro-social behavior creates tangible personal advantages show better outcomes than those appealing to empathy or societal responsibility, concepts that hold little intrinsic value for psychopathic individuals. Perhaps most crucial is protecting intervention providers themselves. Psychopaths readily identify and exploit helper vulnerabilities, making strong professional boundaries and regular supervision essential components of any intervention strategy. Understanding psychopathy as a stable neurological difference rather than a temporary condition creates more realistic intervention goals, focusing on harm reduction and practical management rather than fundamental character transformation. Thank you for attending this presentation series on psychopathy and legal contexts. For more in-depth analysis of these complex issues, please explore Dr. Copper's complete video library, where you'll find extensive resources on psychopathic dynamics across various professional and personal settings. Dr. Copper's evidence-based approach continues to lead the field in developing effective responses to these challenging situations.